Hey, construction enthusiasts. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick shout out to the OGCA Construction Symposium, the go-to event for industry leaders. This year, it's bigger and better, with an expanded education program, an interactive trade show, and exclusive networking opportunities. Join us at the Blue Mountain Resort and Conference Center from April 11th to 13th. Visit ogca.ca for details. Don't miss out on the OGCA Construction Symposium, where innovation meets industry excellence. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm Digital Media Warren Frey, and with me today I have, for another economic analysis show, Chief Economist Alex Carrick and Senior Economist Michael Guckes. And we're going to talk about diversifying the work that GCs and others do with three topics, and then a bonus topic: geography, new versus renovation, and vertical. And then we'll kind of slide into the public versus the public sector. But first, we'll go into geography. And I don't know who wants to tackle this first, how geography affects in terms of starts and your analysis, how you can diversify work you can do.
Well, thank you, Warren. I guess, first of all, I would recommend that listeners, sign up for our webcast that we plan for Thursday, May 9th. And in there, I plan to have a number of tables and charts about population change in Canada and the United States. And I'll try and touch on some of the highlights from that right now. I don't know that people are aware of some of the big changes that are going on in both countries in terms of where the population is moving to. And beginning with Canada, for example, the latest numbers show some very large increases in the Atlantic. And that's never really happened before in a long, long time. But Halifax and Moncton, those cities are growing quite dramatically. And the other one is Alberta. There's an awful lot of population increase that's occurring there, and Ontario as well, I would say. And BC is doing pretty good. In the United States, there's an incredible movement towards the south of the country. The 80% of the population increase in the United States in the last 12 months was to the south. If you look back over the latest 3 years, all of the increase has been to the south. There's been a bit of an increase in the west, but declines in the Northeast and Midwest. In terms of cities, there are 3 cities in Canada and the United States that are having an increase in population, a level increase, not the percentage change, but a level increase of 150,000 people or more. And those 3 cities are Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, and Toronto. And then in the U.S., there's a second tier of cities that's having some large increases. Atlanta, in the latest year, gained about 70,000 people. And Orlando, Tampa, Charlotte, Austin, Phoenix gained about 50,000 people. And you'll notice that all those cities are in the southern United States. And in Canada, Vancouver had an increase of about 80,000, and Calgary about 50,000 people. And there's some cities that have been losing people. In particular, in the U.S., it's been Chicago, San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. In Canada, there's no CMA or census metropolitan area that has lost people. But anyway, there's these population changes, and it's important for some of the other things that we're going to be discussing, like public versus private, because cities have to come up with the finances to provide the services for these increases in population. And there's categories of construction like educational, that depend on things like property taxes and residential construction. And so I'm going to stop talking in just 1 second. But the other thing that I will mention that everybody's waiting for is the drop in interest rates that had been promised this year. And that's it's anticipation of that has been fueling the stock markets, that has been giving business more confidence and encouraging, giving signs of encouragement for construction.
I would just add to that if you recall our expansion index, that looks at data at the metropolitan statistical area. And if you're a smaller general contractor or trade contractor who's not able to, build a nationwide business right now, even within neighboring MSAs, those metropolitan statistical areas, and like Alex said, there's plenty just within the state of Georgia, right? There's 6 or 7 major MSAs. That's not just Atlanta. But you can see how even those MSAs within any given state will vary in terms of their performance and their economic activity. And so as we talk about diversification during this session, I don't want the smaller firms to get the idea that geographic diversification is beyond their reach. Where I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, you could be a GC or a TC who serves Kentucky and Ohio, just crossing the Ohio River into Cincinnati, or you head a little south and you could be easily into any one of 3 or 4, decent sized MSAs within Kentucky. And right there is a diversification option. And, if you look at our data, over time for these neighboring MSAs, you could come up with a strategy that helps you understand, hey, you know what? Sometimes when one MSA is cooling, the one next door to it might be in much better shape, and you could build your diversification strategy around that kind of data as well. So while everything that Alex said is absolutely right, that the ability to diversify is not only for big firms, is just what I wanted to stress in addition to everything that Alex said.
Okay. And in terms of new versus renovation, how has that been a constant, and how has that changed in the last while?
Well, the argument about new versus renovation, the big thing there is, as much as anything, is residential markets, because when new home sales aren't as strong, people are going to perhaps spend more money fixing up their own home if they're not thinking about moving. But there's more than one side to this whole argument. If you've got a very active real estate market, you've also got people fixing up their homes to prepare them to sell them. So it gets to be a little bit tricky. What I can say is that the strength in labor markets is certainly something that's positive for people having the money to go ahead with renovation projects. The problem right now, though, is if you look at retail sales by building product retailers, they're still quite depressed. And so it doesn't appear that renovation is a really strong market right at the present time. And it's the chief characteristic of the construction market overall is private sector money and public sector, a lot of public sector money going into big projects, a lot of private sector money going into to big projects as well. So renovation is always there, and it's a huge part of the total market, more than people often understand. It's probably something approaching half of total residential construction spending in terms of put in place dollars. It's not that big in terms of the ICI categories. It's somewhere between 20 and 30% probably.
And I just have this is kind of a side note, but I mean, how much, I know there was a big bump in renovation due to the pandemic because people were stuck at home and they wanted to live in a nicer place without moving. But have we kind of gotten far away enough from the pandemic that that's not even a factor anymore? Or did it just kind of continue? Or was there like, did you see that it went up and then it kind of went back down again to normal levels? Or yeah, that's just my question is how post quote unquote pandemic, how are we looking at renovations?
Well, that's one of the reasons that the price of lumber went up so much. The price of lumber doubled in 2021, and it was because of people staying at home and putting up backyard gazebos and so on. Everybody was trapped in their backyard, so they were building fancy fences and putting up structures in their backyards, and then restaurants were building
Of course, yeah.
outdoor seating areas. And so, no, most of that has gone back to back to normal.
Yeah, I was just curious.
I think the one thing I would add to that, and I thought Alec was going to get on, he was right at the precipice of it. When you look at civil and non-residential renovation spending, last year in 2023, it was about $297 billion, according to our data on Insight. If you compare that to the new and addition spending last year, again, non-residential only, it was $313 billion. And so, to Alex's point, the amount of money that is in the renovation space is huge. If we're talking just non-residential work, like I said, 300 billion versus 313, it's almost neck and neck. And so as we think about what is happening with financial markets, right? As it becomes much more expensive to build or even renovate, I think the buy versus build calculations begin to change for a lot of these developers and owners. Can you even get the financing for a new structure? That might be pretty hard in this environment. It's certainly harder than it has been historically speaking. On the other hand, maybe banks are more willing to allow a renovation at a much lower cost to them, or at least at a much lower amount of debt being extended or credit being extended. And so that discussion of new versus renovation, I think right now is a very important one, because the dynamics that exist outside of the physical construction itself may be favoring some renovation work right now. And so again, talking to the general contractors and the trade contractors, right? Are you diversifying your work across both new and renovation, making sure that you realize, that renovation work, if I do the quick math real fast here, I think last year's renovation spending increased by 13.5%. Well, that's huge. That's opportunity right there if you're not thinking about it. So that was just what I would add to the discussion around diversifying by looking at both renovation and new and addition work.
And next, we're going to talk about verticals. Now, I will tell you right now that the word vertical is about the extent of my knowledge of vertical. So maybe you guys could explain what the concept is, because I'm sure somebody else is in the same boat I am first, before we kind of get to how that affects diversification.
Well, vertical, that simply means the type of the structure. Like within commercial construction, it's between retail and office buildings, private office buildings, government office buildings, data centers, entertainment facilities, and institutional, it's schools and hospitals, and engineering, it's roads and sewers and waterworks and that sort of thing. Within commercial, I really like the subject of buy versus build, because if you're an owner, and this is usually come up as a subject for people who are office developers. Like, does it make more sense to build an office building or to simply purchase another office building? And it'd be interesting to hear what the developers themselves are saying these days, because, of course, right now, there isn't a lot of demand for office buildings. So there's this whole question of whether those properties are worth anything like what they were before the pandemic. And this gets into the subject of whether there's the potential for some real financial trouble in the financial sector because of property valuations. But build versus buy, I don't know where that would stand right now with the demand so low. But anyway, certainly data center in terms of vertical construction activity, data centers are still going like mad because there's so many, everything's in the clouds these days, and it's hard to see how that will ever really be terribly impacted. Retail, I think retail is going to come back because bricks and mortar retail is a form of entertainment. People like to get out and go shopping and take their families out to the mall and so on. It's going to take a while, but it's going to come back. Warehouse construction, that's had a huge dip in the United States because there was overbuilding of the facilities. But again, because there's this being this shift to hybrid work, which means people working from home, they're going to continue to buy over the internet. So that's going to mean an ongoing demand for fulfillment and distribution centers.
Right, and data centers.
Yeah, and data centers. And educational, I was worried about education at one point. I'm not nearly as worried about it now as I was. For one thing, stock markets have come back. That means endowment funds have more money in them. And again, there's all these new jobs that people have and all these new employment opportunities that they have. And they've got to learn these new skills. And so I think universities are seeing the opportunities in that.
You know, when you look at last year's performance by vertical, and I'm taking it up a level from you, Alec, but let's talk about the diversification of outcomes, right? So you had mentioned on the I think the bottom end of that, industrial had a rough 2023. Our data shows that spending on that vertical was down 34%, but we have to keep in mind the fact that industrial spending just exploded in the years prior. And what we're seeing is not really a contraction in industrial and warehouse spending, but I think sort of a cooling off of one of the hottest periods we've ever recorded in that sector, right? So, down 34% last year, coming off of incredible highs. On the flip side, right, the fastest growing vertical was military spending at 43%. Military spending, like many of the other categories, it's a little bit of a boom and bust, which is the whole point of diversification. We saw last year that military spending grew 43%. And then in the middle, we had things like educational, as you mentioned, up 20% between 2023 and 2022. Community spending was up 3%. It had a little bit of a boring year. But the important thing to recognize is that each one of these verticals has a boom and a bust cycle that is timing independent of many of the other verticals. And so you don't ever want to put all of your efforts and resources into just marketing and targeting to one vertical, because you'll be stuck riding the booms and busts of that given vertical. I think the better thing to do, right, would be to try to diversify, find work across a few verticals at least, and try to pick verticals that maybe have unique timing, so that one is in a lull, another one might be in a surge, and you can ride the surges rather than riding both the booms and the bust.
Okay. Sorry, Alex, do you have something else you want to add?
No, the thing is that each vertical has specialty knowledge attached to it as well, which is interesting. For example, I've certainly done an awful lot of presentations over the last number of years, beginning with the pandemic, because it was easier to do it virtually and so on. So I've been talking to groups all over both Canada and the US virtually. And I've learned a lot by talking to specialized trade associations and so on. And just to give one example, I talked to a group of people who were supplying the hospital sector. And they kept talking in the background about something called cups And I didn't know what the heck CUPS was. So I finally asked, and you hesitate to ask because then it looks like you're kind of a dummy. But
well, we know that's not true, but okay.
but that doesn't generally stop me.
Mm.
But CUPS is a fascinating story in hospitals because what they are central utility plants.
Mm.
And apparently to save on money, because hospitals are notoriously expensive to build, there's a lot of
7.
there's a lot of offloading of about 20% of the capital cost to somebody else to build the central utility plants. And that's a way to save money. And then you lease back the CUP and saves you money on the upfront capital cost. And it's still to be determined whether long-term that saves you money. But if you are going to diversify, it's also the case that you do have to try to acquire some of this specialized knowledge, and you can use the lingo that's used in
Yes.
some of these subcategories.
Okay, and finally, I like to talk about public versus private sector, which you guys told me off mic is kind of tied into the whole vertical thing. So maybe you could explain what that means, and then we'll go into public versus private, which is its own form of diversification, because government spending also goes and booms and busts too, I guess.
Michael's done a lot of work in this area. So, Michael, by all means, you can lead the discussion here.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, and I think this discussion point very nicely ties us back to what we were just talking about on the vertical side, because there are plenty of verticals that are public spending funded, right? Alec talked about education. There all sorts of public infrastructure is another.
You mentioned the military.
Example of that, right?
That's about the biggest.
That's about the biggest, right?
Publicly funded, yeah.
Right. And certainly because of the different funding mechanisms of these projects, of public projects versus private, we do see that demand for them is very different, especially when the economy is going through a bust. Nowadays, of course, I really mean the government. The government says, hey, we're going through an economic lull. How do we offset that? And in every major, I think, economic down period since really at least 2007. I'm sure that you could talk about examples prior to that, but really starting with 2007, right? We got this whole idea of Tiger grants and other public spending injections to help bolster the economy when the private sector is lagging. And that's exactly what we have seen, right? We saw that in the Great Recession. We saw that during COVID. And my suspicion is that kind of mindset is here to stay, simply because it's so politically attractive, right? Why not spend money when people and the economy really need it? It makes the politicians look great. The interesting thing about that, too, is that during really difficult economic periods, going back to COVID through present, because we have data for it, but the number of projects that we see across both sectors that experience either a delayed bid date or put on hold or are abandoned, those behaviors really begin to differ during a downturn. And so, for example, during COVID, it was interesting to see that, for example, a lot of government projects in 2020 were put on hold, but they weren't abandoned. In the private sector is very different. In the private sector, of course, we saw a surge of abandonments because people just weren't sure what to do there. And so that was just one example, right? When interest rates rose beginning in 2022, government stress levels, government projects and public projects really didn't report increases in bid date delays or on holds or abandonments, but we saw something of a knee-jerk reaction among private projects as they responded in their much faster responsiveness, I guess, to that kind of stuff, right? And that's what we would expect. We would expect that when the economy sours, the private sector is going to be much faster to respond to hardships than government projects are, just because, again, it comes back to funding. And so if you've been in the public sector, if you've been working on public sector jobs for the last 2 years, you have seen far less of the chaos, for lack of a better word, that we have seen among private projects that are being either abandoned or put on hold across the U.S. And so that's, again, one more reason to think of your diversification strategy carefully and make sure that you're using all four of the pillars that we've talked about today. We may not, some people may look at public work and say, there's lots of red tape. It's more laborious to get through the projects, and there's more stipulations and other challenges just associated with doing public work. And having worked in public construction and in public government for a while, I completely understand that complaint, or that that observation. I'll call it an observation, not a complaint. But we've seen that observation among contractors doing public work, and yet the whole point, though, is that it is fantastic for those firms that when the private sector is struggling, to be able to go back to public work or to stock up on public work can really help to level set revenues. And I think that's really important, is the whole reason for diversification, right? Why would we encourage a firm to diversify? And one of the biggest reasons is just to help level set revenues, because when you do that, now you can make sure that you keep your crews busy. You don't have to lay off talent. And especially in this economy and moving forward, I think finding talented workers is going to be the absolute hardest thing for the construction industry to do moving forward. We have for many, many years not had enough people entering the trades. And with the retirement of the baby boomers, which was accelerated because of COVID, that labor supply crunch is tighter than ever. And there is no really good way to solve it. There's certainly no fast way to solve that problem. And so being able to protect your labor pool is, I think, probably the most important thing that firms need to do. And that's why their diversification strategy should be top of mind, because it's going to help them protect that labor pool that they have.
Alec, do you have anything general to add? But also, are there any Canadian aspects of this that are differ from what American? Obviously, America has a lot more money to spend governmentally than we do, for one.
What I would say is that the governments, the public sector does have, it's going to have a pretty major issue, because one of the things is that it's trying to drive the economy towards decarbonization, and it's the same in Canada, it's the same in the United States, and that's going to cost money. So governments are going to be happy when interest rates come down as well, because that certainly drives up their carrying costs and so on. So there's another side to that, which is municipal bonds and so on. It's easier to raise money if interest rates are high. So all these things generally have more than just one side to them. But the fact that the economy is doing well, that there isn't the recession that everybody was talking about in the United States, that incomes are high and people are paying their taxes, and property taxes have been staying high, all of these things are positive for the public sector, and in terms of helping them to spend the money that is needed for the population shifts and the population changes and so on. But I return to the fact that I don't know what government's going to do about electrification and all the efforts that they want to make towards decarbonization, because there's going to have to be tremendous increases in electric power capacity and transmission lines and recharging stations and so on. And they're going to try and offload a lot of this onto the private sector. But even there, all of this depends, and we're sort of getting off track here, but all of this depends on convincing everybody to switch over to buying electric vehicles. It's funny, because there really is a bird's eye view of all these things. And decarbonization everywhere around the world depends on this massive shift to electric vehicles. Without it, it's going to be hard to achieve the goals. And there is something really hiding in the bushes, and that is if consumers don't want to switch to electric vehicles.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm gonna stop there because that gets into a whole other, possibly bleaker subject area.
Okay, no problem. We don't want to end bleak. Yeah, it is known as a dismal science after all. So on that note, guys, I would like to thank you for joining us. I'm sure our audience learned a bunch. I learned what a vertical is for one. So until next time, I bid you both adieu.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Warren.